Hi, my name is Paige. Welcome to my channel. So October has now ended, and that means the end of spooky season for most people. I mean, it's always pretty much in my heart personally. But I wanted to come to you today with a wrap-up, a spooky October horror wrap-up of all the books I read in October for the theme of Halloween and spooky season, etc. That's why I haven't taken down my Halloween-esque decorations yet, because I wanted to save them for this video, and then I will take them down after this one, unfortunately. I ended up finishing 3 books in October. They were all horror/thrillers, and I ended up finishing The Beautiful by Renee Ahdieh after October ended, like the next day, which is unfortunate because that would have been a good book to cover in this video, but you will see that in my next wrap-up. However, I am very happy with the books that I chose to read in October because 2 of them I think are basically classics at this point, and one of them is sort of a recent newcomer to the horror genre/mystery genre. But the first one I finished was The Shining by Stephen King. If you are a returning visitor to my channel, then you know that I started The Shining in September to make sure that I finished it by the end of October, so I was successful in that. The Shining is the second book I have finished by Stephen King. The first one was The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. This is a classic horror thriller fiction novel. If you don't know much about it, then kudos to you for staying out of the loop, but basically it is about a family who goes and stays at a very remote hotel. The father figure of the family, Jack Torrance, is hired by the management of this hotel in the mountains called the Overlook, and so he goes there with his wife and his small son to overlook the hotel during their off-season because it is completely blocked off from the world. The roads closed because the snow is so heavy and so intense. So basically he's just hired to make sure that the hotel continues to work and doesn't fall to ruin during their off-season. I kind of grew up with The Shining, not the book obviously, but the movie, which is actually quite different in my opinion, and so I've always wanted to read The Shining and just never got around to it. If you're coming here having watched the movie and not read the book, I would suggest reading the book. It has a lot of nuances that are lost in the movie. For example, one of the main things that is kind of lost in the movie, or just not as accentuated as maybe it should be, is the fact that Jack's son, Danny, is very gifted. He's very sensitive to people around him, so he can pick up on thoughts, he can pick up on memories, just different things like that, which comes in handy / is very disturbing when he's placed in a situation or in an environment where there are so many memories, and violent ones at that. So obviously Danny in the Overlook Hotel is not a good mixture. And that's a really big component of the book, is just watching how Danny deals with the horrors of the Overlook and how his powers really strengthen the hotel and its menacing entities. I really enjoyed that added depth to Danny's character, and I also enjoyed the fact that Jack in the book is much more intellectual than he is in the movie, in my opinion. He's kind of like a brute in the movie. That's not saying anything against Jack Nicholson's portrayal of him. I think that's just the way that the director decided to take his character. In the book, you really get to see the way his mind works, which is fun and also a little bit confusing considering the turn things take, but I won't spoil anything if you are both unfamiliar with the movie and the book. I ended up giving this book 4 stars, I think maybe between 3.5 and 4 stars, because once again, Stephen King's writing, I think I do enjoy it, but it is very wordy, and he takes a lot of time on things that maybe don't need to be taken so much time on. And I think I enjoy his writing more in a short capacity, if that makes sense. I think I'll always enjoy his writing more so in short stories and short novels, even novellas, because consuming his really big books is just a lot to undertake. And I find myself often getting distracted and kind of like pulling away from the writing. It took me a long time to read The Shining. I think it was basically a month, and that's a long time since it's not one of his longest books. I'll also put up a spoiler warning here. I don't really think it's a big deal if you're not too worried about spoilers because it's not a big one, but one thing I found a little bit confusing and not very scary in the book was the aspect of the moving hedge animals. So they're like haunted and they like move when you're not looking at them, and I guess it's kind of creepy. It's kind of like the idea of the mannequins who like move when you're not looking, or like the paintings whose eyes move and watch you. I didn't really like the concept that much because it wasn't scary to me. It was kind of like goofy. Something that did scare me was the sort of the tunnel that Danny plays in, where he feels like a presence and there's like another thing in there with him. I thought that was pretty creepy. So definitely not everything about the playground sequence was wasteful, but I feel like the hedge animals didn't really get me, and that he spent a considerable amount of time on it. Anyway, that's generally how I felt about The Shining. It's a very condensed version, so I do still suggest it if you're looking for sort of a scary book, and if you're interested in reading Stephen King. It's a classic, so you can't really go wrong. If you don't like it, then you can always just put it down. So moving on, the next book that I finished in October was The Butterfly Garden by Hutchison. This is the first book in a sort of anthology series, so like every book is focused on a different mystery, I think, probably in the same world, but I don't know too much about the other books. I do know that I have been wanting to read this book for ages. If you saw my huge unboxing from Barnes & Noble where I got all the books online that I've wanted forever and never got, then that was one of the books that I finally got, and I was really excited about it because this book kind of took the mystery lover community by storm. I feel like even though it's pretty unassuming, the cover is, and the reviews are like kind of subtle, actually this is a very well rated book and a very well loved book, considering it's not from an author that is like Stephen King or Joe Hill. Essentially it starts off with a woman in an interrogation room, and the investigators are asking her questions because she has just been rescued or, you know, recovered from a place called the Butterfly Garden. So basically she is telling her story throughout the book of her being kidnapped and forced to live as a butterfly in the collector's garden. So she and a lot of other young women are kidnapped and like stored, or they're forced to live in this like sort of greenhouse, like giant greenhouse. I don't know, I could never fully picture the setting 100% while I was reading, but that's the general gist of it. It's very messed up, and really if I say anything else about it, that'll kind of spoil it for you, so I don't want to do that. But basically it's a really interesting book because Maya, the protagonist that is telling her story in the interrogation room, actually gets to tell the stories of many of the other young women that she spends time with, so those deceased and those that survived and all of in between, and how she got to know the collector, so the man who kidnapped her, how her relationship was with his two sons. I like the way the book is written because it builds suspense. You're wondering what the end result is because you're forced to stay in this interrogation room with this woman and hear her whole story, and she goes on a lot of side stories that are very interesting and you want to know about, but at the same time you're like waiting for that end result. I really enjoyed this book, as I knew I probably would. However, I did not give it 5 stars. I gave it 4, maybe 4.5, because, and again, like I've said this so many times about mystery novels, the reason why I don't give them 5 stars sometimes is again for this book because of the ending. I really didn't enjoy the way the novel concluded. It felt cheap, it didn't make a lot of sense, and I was just generally confused about the way it wrapped up, because like the leaps that the author makes to like make the ending work, they're too far. Like it doesn't really make sense to me. And with that being said, I did enjoy the book a whole lot. I don't regret reading it. I would suggest it to others, even with the ending being the way it is. So if you're looking for a good mystery novel, I would suggest checking it out. I mean, it's short, it's good, and you can't really go wrong with that, right? So the last book I read in October, last but not least, was The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. You can probably tell by my face that I am very excited that I finally got to read this book. I've wanted to read this book far before the TV show came out, but when it did come out I was very excited to watch it and I was very impressed. It's one of my favorite Netflix shows, or maybe just shows in general. I don't know what you guys thought of it, but I really loved it and I hope they make a second season. And now that I've read the book, I want to actually rewatch the first season because thinking back to it and while I was reading this book, I could see different references I missed in the show that were from the book. For example, like the cup with the stars at the bottom. I can't remember in what capacity that was talked about or referenced in the show, but I remember it being talked about in the show and I didn't really understand the significance until I read the book. So basically, if you are unfamiliar with The Haunting of Hill House, this is another classic. It's from the 50s, late 50s. That's when Shirley Jackson wrote it, and it follows a woman who is written to by a professor who is looking to do a paranormal investigation of a house called Hill House. So basically, he contacts the owner of the house, who sends her nephew to help him with this investigation or just look over the proceedings. And then he sends out a bunch of letters to different people who have had paranormal experiences that have been reported in the news or whatever. And the sort of main character of the book, Eleanor, is one of those such people. Most people don't accept his invitation to partake in the investigation, but Eleanor does. The nephew of the owner, Luke, comes to stay with him, and another woman named Theodora. So they're all very different characters. They have vastly different personalities, and that's what kind of contributes to the air of like uncertainty in the book, because Eleanor is a very fragile, very like emotionally constrained character, and she doesn't have a lot of social experience because she's been taking care of her ailing mother for her whole life, I think, and she doesn't have a good relationship with her sister, so having to suddenly like be a part of this weird like temporary family with these three other people is both very exciting for her and also very nerve-wracking. Anyway, so the book, unlike the movie, is not very creepy in my opinion. It's a very subtle sort of horror. The creepiest thing about the book is that nothing is super clear. Like even at the end, you're not entirely sure if something paranormal happened or if it was all in their heads or whatever. I was actually a little bit disappointed by that because I wanted it to be a little bit scarier. I had high hopes because of the TV show, and I know I shouldn't have had that conception because TV shows are always going to try to be spookier and give you more like jump scares than books are going to do, obviously, but I did have a higher expectation in that regard, so that was a little bit disappointing, but not really, even though I enjoyed the whole dynamic between the group and I enjoyed the sort of weird history surrounding Hill House. The reason why I didn't give it 5 stars is because it is a little bit dated, and when I say that, I'm not talking about really the language, because I didn't have a hard time understanding their language or anything. It was just the constant, confusing banter between all of the characters. So they had this like very weird way of communicating with each other where they were always like bantering or like teasing one another, and it just always confused me because I wasn't sure if they were being like rude or if they were being even kind. I couldn't determine the line between rude and like kind, friendly, friendship-y, if you know what I mean. And that really threw me off the entire book, and I'm not sure, that could have been on purpose. It might not be a matter of a dated book or dated like conversation standards or something like that. It might be because she was trying to actually throw her readers off with the conventional way that the characters talk to each other, but for me it was just like too much. Like I just felt like I was constantly like, what is happening? Because I can't decide if they're growing closer or if they're growing farther apart or if they're annoyed with each other or if they're having a good time. And I couldn't rely on Eleanor's reactions to everything because somebody would say something that I thought was really rude and she would be like, you know, she would respond in kind and it would be like a funny exchange. And then other times, like somebody would say something that was not as rude in my opinion, but she would take great offense to it or something, and I would be like, well, what does that mean exactly? So that's the only reason I didn't give it 5 stars, and I honestly think that's more of a personal decision. It wasn't really a judgment of the book itself because it's a classic for a reason. It really set the precedent for other horror novels and horror culture that followed it. For example, one of my favorite Stephen King related productions was Rose Red. It was a mini-series like back in the 90s or the early 2000s, and I adored that miniseries. Not a lot of people talk about it now, but it was very well received, and it is very hard to find physical copies of the miniseries, so I haven't seen it in years. If you know what I'm talking about, please leave a comment below and tell me what you think of Rose Red, because I haven't met anyone that I can really talk to about it, because no one remembers it and nobody like even knows it exists. But yeah, Rose Red is very similar to The Haunting of Hill House in that a group of very different characters comes to Rose Red, which is the name of the mansion in that miniseries. They come to Rose Red to do a paranormal investigation led by a professor, I believe. A female professor in that case, but yeah, it's very similar in that way. I haven't really read on it, but I would assume that Stephen King took inspiration from The Haunting of Hill House because it has a very similar vibe, although I will say that Rose Red fundamentally is a very different place. It just has that same like paranormal team goes to a haunted house kind of vibe. Anyway, so those were all 3 of the books that I read in October. I wish I could have read more. I mean, it's spooky season and I love horror, mystery, thriller anyway, so I would have preferred to read more, but it was also midterms month. Sort of midterms time, so it kind of restricted me from reading everything I wanted to. I have The Whisper Man by Alex North that I really want to finish before the end of the year, because I believe it is up for a reward, or not a reward, an award on Goodreads, and I want to read it before I vote for anything. It is 12 o'clock and I have to get up at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. So I guess that means I should probably sign off and go to bed. But before I go, I wanted to quickly just point out to you that I have new glasses. I don't know if you noticed, but insert old glasses here. They definitely don't have as thick of a frame, even though you can kind of see the black behind. So you can see a lot more of my face, I think. They're also much rounder, so I'm definitely channeling Harry Potter now. Anyway, guys, I hope you have a lovely week, a lovely weekend, and I will see you back here hopefully in a week with my second Gettysburg vlog. Alright, I'll see you back here soon.